Hi, Little Justice leaders. Welcome. I am so excited for the conversation we are having today. If you don't know me, I'm Shelby. I'm the creator of Little Justice Leaders. At Little Justice Leaders, we help schools, educators, and families build learning spaces that are rooted in justice and belonging. And today we are talking to someone who knows a lot about those things. Our special guest is Dr. Katie Welch. And Katie has been in education for more than 9 years. And she has experience teaching across the elementary school level, as well as being an assistant principal. She also has her master's degree in literacy and a doctorate of education concentrated in transformational school leadership. So clearly, she is an expert on all things related to social justice in education and school leadership. So welcome, Katie. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you.
Me too. So can you start by just telling us a little bit about yourself, your education experience, and how you got into education?
Absolutely. So you covered a lot of it in your introduction. Thank you for
Mhm.
that.
Yes.
I grew up just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and I was one of those kids who I had younger siblings, younger cousins. I was always the automatic babysitter. I just always kind of connected with kids really well. So it was not a surprise to anyone when I decided to go into teaching. I also have a ton of family who's in education. I have aunts and uncles who are teachers, as well as an uncle who's an administrator. So it's in my blood, it's in my genes. And it's something that I always thought about doing. And then I went into my first education class in my undergrad. And I remember walking out of there being like, this makes sense for me. I like had a special feeling about it kind of, which sounds a little corny, but it really did. I like felt it.
I
And
love that.
yeah. So, I went to school for undergrad, got my degree in elementary education and English literature. And I actually, during my thesis for my English literature degree, my professor was all confused because I was like, well, I want to do children's literature. Like, how can I do something to focus on that? And she had never really had anybody ask that before. So when I think about it now, knowing what I know now, and as much as I've grown since then, like, I don't think I understood how much I was taking on, but I did Ruby Bridges' story actually, and kind of looked at
Wow.
Ruby Bridges' story was
Yeah.
covered children's literature. And so I think I kind of got a glimpse of it then, but didn't really know what I was
Mhm.
doing at the time. And I think if I was to look back on it now, knowing what I know, I would do a much better job. But I do think it's interesting that, like, even then, that was kind of the route that I wanted to go, was tackling something, pretty intense in children's literature, something that matters so
Mhm.
much in our current climate. And then I went into my master's in literacy, went straight into that after
Wow.
undergrad. And then COVID hit, and I was getting the itch again to kind of go back to school and see what came next. So I was teaching, as you said, kind of different grade levels, K to 5. And I found a program at Northeastern University. And what I liked about it was, well, two things kind of caught my attention. One was the social justice lens, which I think we'll talk about in a little bit. And then also the action research part of it, which meant that I
Mhm.
would actually be doing the work with my community and doing the work and doing the research right there where I was working to see a little bit more immediate impact. So that was really cool. And when I decided to focus and concentrate on transformative school leadership, my administration approached me about taking on the assistant principal position because our assistant principal had gotten a principalship. So it all kind of fell into place in a really weird way that I wasn't expecting. But I've been doing it now for 3 years with full time teaching, which is unique and challenging at times. But
Definitely.
one of my favorite parts about it is I get to still be so immersed with
Mhm.
my students and also have that connection with my colleagues to kind of like still be in the trenches, so to speak, but also have that kind of insight and ability to be in the room to kind of talk about things and make decisions and kind of have that influence too, which I really like being a part of that too. So
Yeah.
I don't know where it's going to lead, but been in the field for 9 years and just kind of seeing what comes. And it seems to all be kind of coming at the time where I need it. So
Yeah. I love that so much. And I feel like so many aspects of your story speak to what a lot of educators in social justice education and really just educators in general experience with kind of the trajectory of changes over the years that maybe are a little unpredictable, a little unique, but kind of work out in perfect timing. And then also just with your story about your work with the Ruby Bridges stories, thinking about, looking back now, you would probably do it differently. You've learned so much and maybe would approach it in a different way. And I think that's really common for social justice educators to say, 10 years ago, the way I was doing things, or 5 years ago, the way I was doing things, or even a year ago, the way I was doing things, I would not do them that way now. And that's just part of the journey, right? We're all growing, we're learning, we figure these things out as we go. We all have so much to unlearn when it comes to bias and justice and what, belonging and inclusion and equity really look like in schooling. So anyway, I really appreciated that aspect of it.
I'm like such an advocate for that. Knowledge is like, it's not meant to make us feel bad about what we've done or
Mhm.
the way we've approached situations. It's like we can use that knowledge to change and do better. And it's not something to be ashamed of necessarily, as long as you're actively working to do better.
100%. I think like if anyone who, wants to be a social justice educator or is a social justice educator really has to adopt that mindset because
Mhm.
things will always change. You will always get better. If you're, consistently learning, you're going to look back on things that you've done in the past and realize maybe that it could have been done in a different way. And that's just part of the process. So we all just have to accept it.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. It sounds like your graduate programs and especially your doctorate program were really rooted in social justice work. So tell me about like how that impacted your view of education. We got into this a little bit, but would love to hear any other insights you have.
Well, honestly, it it changed my look at education, but it really impacted the way I look at everything. It was such a perspective shift for me
Yeah.
in general. And I think the key to that was that it allowed me to go backward in a lot of ways and learn kind of about the systems and how they came to be and how they were established, especially in this country. And how that kind of has led to a lot of what we're seeing in education now. And obviously, the world's a whole different place than it was even 10 years ago, even
Mhm.
20 years ago, from when education started in this country. But it allowed me to go back in order to go forward. So I was able to kind of learn all of these things and use that knowledge to kind of influence my thinking and my way of interacting with the education system. And again, I feel like that knowledge piece goes so much farther than we give it credit for.
Yeah.
Like just knowing where these oppressive pieces came from, knowing where like the foundations of some of these common threads in education that that especially socially just educators think about and talk about, knowing where they came from allowed me to really look at things differently. It
Hmm.
allowed my students differently, my coworkers differently, the way that administration operates or has
Hmm.
to operate in some situations.
Yeah.
It's really just starts from all the way back then, and you don't
Yeah.
really realize it until you are faced with it. And
Hmm.
I feel fortunate that I was given the resources because it's
Hmm.
not stuff I would have necessarily been able to find on my own,
Yeah.
but I was given access to those resources and, for lack of a better word, forced because I was
Yeah.
in classes and I was
Right.
being taught these things, and we had a assignment each quarter to reflect upon the social justice piece of our learning. And so we had to constantly update and reflect
Yeah.
on like new things that we've learned and new ways that we've
Yeah.
incorporated it into our day to day. So it was beyond just the scope of education, but I definitely see it gave me like confidence to speak to things a little bit more and speak up a little bit more and kind of just carefully, but and tactfully bring up things that maybe other people haven't thought of. And not in a way to force thinking on anyone, but more so just to raise the perspective that might not have been addressed before, even by me 5 years ago. So I give my graduate program a lot of credit for just giving me that basis of knowledge, which allows me to speak in spaces with more confidence and with more knowledge base about all these things that really do impact us now that started so long ago.
Absolutely. And I think that's, such an important point of like you kind of talked about zooming back or, in history and time, but also like pulling back from the day to day of education to really understand how the system works. And I think that's something so many teachers don't always have the chance to do, right? If you're in the classroom, you're in the trenches every single day. And if you didn't have the opportunity, like you were talking about, to go to a program that's focused in that, then I think it can be hard to have that moment of realization that that might be a thing worth doing. So But the folks in our community and hopefully the folks finding us will find this opportunity to back up, to look at the systems, to understand the history. And I think what's really beautiful about that is that kind of mirrors what we're asking our students to do, right? Which
Oh,
is often like back in history, understand how things came to be, kind of zoom out from the very narrow, small, specific perspective that we all might have to understand how do these systems work in the larger community, in the larger state, country, world. So yeah, I love that because I just think it's such a good example of what we're actually trying to get
right.
everybody to do and what we're pushing ourselves, I think, challenging ourselves constantly to do in a more meaningful way.
Well, and I think that's the key, right? Is it's a constant process. It's not something you do once or you
Right.
read one article or you listen to one podcast and
Mhm.
you have to constantly work at it, which again, I know with education, time is like the biggest challenge.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, and with a lot of like educators that I've actually physically spoken to and had
Mhm.
research about and things like that. So I feel pretty confident saying that time
Yes.
is the biggest barrier.
Yeah.
Teachers don't have the time to do that, but, like, I truly feel like with what your organization is doing and, if we can push that out that it's worth it and that it
Yeah.
will, like, gradually, it can't be all done at once, so,
Right.
like, if you find ways to plug things in for yourself and also for your students, it's just gonna have a bigger long-term impact.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Katie, you have specialized in your graduate program and also in practice in social justice and school leadership. So, tell us about what does social justice look like in school leadership? How do you think about bringing justice to your school? Yeah, anything else you have to share about like justice in leadership?
So I'm going to start with something that's a little bit corny, but I think starting with kindness really matters. I think it goes a lot further than we give it credit for. And I do work in an elementary school. So I am working with the littlest of learners, and I'm not going to get much out of them if I'm coming from a place of negativity or things like that.
Absolutely.
So kindness definitely has its place in my leadership style. For sure. But I also think it goes a long way with the people I'm working with the district overall and things like that. But I think it's about like the story and understanding as much as you can and building relationships, whether that's with colleagues, families, other administrators, students. I think knowing the story as a leader gives you one more ground to stand on, when you're making bigger decisions, more impactful decisions. But it also helps you be a leader that is trusted. And I think so much of social justice education has to come from a place of trust because you have to feel comfortable and safe in a space to be able to practice social justice and to be able to actually carry out kind of the principles of it, if that makes sense. And I think with my particular brand of leadership, I guess, it's about like acknowledging your bias. I think that's a big place to start and embracing the fact that bias doesn't have to necessarily be a negative thing. It can be a learning tool. And it can give you a space to embrace the differences of the people in your community that you're working with. It gives you an opportunity to take a step back. I think leaders are often, especially now where everything's so instant and, needs to be done and settled yesterday, even though the issue happened 5 minutes ago. I think sometimes and I struggle with this myself. It's something I'm working on to like take a step back and think, you know what, I don't know enough about that situation. I need to like give myself some more understanding of this in order to like speak to this well. So like everybody needs to take a step back and kind of like taking those opportunities to embrace challenges, embrace differences, acknowledge where our information might be missing, acknowledge where my weaknesses might be, and like use that to make a more informed decision. And again, in practice, sometimes that's way easier said than done. But I think, acknowledging that that's what needs to happen in order to make decisions that are just and safe and fair in a bigger school community, I think is a really good first step and something that I'm actively trying to work on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really good example and acknowledgement that, like, right, these things are sometimes harder in practice, but the first step is understanding how they could or should work, so that we can slow ourselves down when that does happen. To at least ask the questions, right? Is there another way to go about this? Can I, be more thoughtful in my approach? And sometimes maybe the answer is no, right? And you got to respond in the moment. And that's the reality sometimes, but other times maybe we can slow it down and be more thoughtful. So something really related to this that you're also interested in are trauma-informed practices, right? Which are going to be such an important kind of groundwork for a school rooted in social justice. So can you give us some examples of like what does that look like? What does trauma-informed practices? What do they actually look like in schools?
Sure. So that was the focus of my research. So that's my sweet spot. But one of the biggest things that came out of it for me, one of the biggest things was the definition of trauma, and understanding that trauma is not the event, but it's the response to the event. So I think that that's a really common misunderstanding is like, and especially now in like the TikTok generation where everything, like that word gets thrown around so much. But scientifically and, based in research, trauma is not the event that happened, it's the response to it. So, something could happen when you're sitting in the same room as somebody that would be considered a traumatic event, but the way that my body and my brain kind of process that thing might be very different than the person sitting next to me. And that's all based on past experiences and the way that your brain operates and the way that you feel things in your body. So it's all, connected to each other and it's all very complex. And I'm not an expert in the scientific part of things and the neurological part of things, but what I do understand is the where that has a place in education. And one of the key pieces that I came across in my research is that teachers felt a little intimidated by the word trauma informed. And I think that when, we spoke about it, it made some of the teachers I was working with feel like they needed to be an expert. When you're informed on something, you need to feel like you know everything about it. And quite frankly, I don't know everything about it. And I spent 3 years on it. Right. So it's something that I wanted to give that like room to. And we kind of came around to being trauma aware and using awareness instead of internets because it felt a little bit more comfortable because, a good educator is aware of their students' experiences to the extent that they can be and should be. And so using that awareness allows you to build, like we were talking about, trust. It allows you to build a safe space. It allows you to build community within your classroom because kids can't learn if they don't have access to those things. I'm not going to make a lot of academic gains with a student who isn't feeling content in the space that, we're in for 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. So my go-to when it comes to what should you start with when it comes to being trauma informed or trauma aware is really focusing on relationship building. And that can be across your whole classroom, or it can be if you have a student that's really struggling, or that there's something in their past or in their family or something that goes even further back, to think about like socioeconomic status or culture or race or things that, much bigger than what an elementary school kids might be able to kind of even talk about. If I'm building a relationship with that student, if I'm giving them a space to feel safe, then I'm going to be able to educate them. I'm going to be able to access them in a way that's going to actually make progress in a classroom.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And, thinking about the fact that you're in an elementary school, and many folks would say that elementary is too young to be thinking about justice work, to maybe even be thinking about like trauma-informed practices or trauma-aware practices. And, justice and belonging and equity, it's all too early. They're too young. It's too complex. What are your thoughts on that as an elementary school teacher and school leader?
My first thought is I get it. I really do. I have been in a position where, I might have said the wrong thing or stumbled over my words or pretended to not hear something because it was something that I couldn't or didn't want to or didn't know how to in the moment address, But I think the biggest piece of that is it doesn't necessarily come from what the kids can do and are capable of. It comes a lot from our fear as adults and as educators.
Yeah.
And it's a very valid fear. And it's a very legitimate fear because, you don't want to say the wrong thing. You don't want to say the thing that's going to, get you in trouble or, find you in a situation where you aren't as, careful with your words as maybe you should be or could be. But I do really think that kids are capable of a lot more than we give them credit for at this age. I do really think that if we give them opportunities in age appropriate ways, interwoven into the curriculum, using teachable moments, that's what we do as teachers, as we do as educators, is we find moments to teach kids beyond just the confines of a curriculum. We use that, of course, to make the progress that we need our kids to make, but finding those moments and those pockets of like building them up as human beings and as socially just and socially aware human beings, like that's really the sweet spot. And one area that I personally use a lot of this is in my social studies curriculum. I've been a social studies focused teacher for many of my years in teaching, and I'm in my fifth grade classroom. And there's a lot of opportunities there. I really find a lot of opportunities in social studies curriculum to kind of address these things. And sometimes it's as simple as posing an open ended question about a topic of oppression. We're covering the American Revolution, we're covering the Civil War in our standards. So these things have to come up, right? And when I taught first grade, we talk about culture and we talk about differences. So you use different words. I'm not going to be talking to first graders necessarily in the language that I would use with my fifth graders because that wouldn't be age appropriate. But there are ways to address these concepts and give kids an opportunity to talk about the things that they've seen and felt and currently feel, when you're talking about tough things. And I think it's all about just giving them the opportunity and knowing that, again, you can take the space to say, you know what, that's a really good point. I don't exactly know how to respond to that, and sometimes that teaches kids too that it's okay to not know all the answers. And I think that in itself is another learning moment, right?
Absolutely. I love that. And I think, it's, sometimes can be delicate. Sometimes like there's a lot for us to learn, for us to move past our fears. But I think it's so important because young people really can, understand and think more deeply than we might give them credit for a lot of times. Katie, this has been such an amazing conversation. I've learned so much. I'm sure that our community has learned a lot from this conversation. So thank you so much for your time and insights. Is there a way for our community to find your work, support you, connect with you?
Absolutely. No, this has been great. I really love getting to talk about these kinds of things,
Yeah.
space that is working to make it more commonplace,
Yeah.
to give our kids the opportunity to really investigate these types of things safely. But yeah, in terms of reaching out to me, I'm definitely on LinkedIn
Okay.
at Welch. And then I also have a Instagram that I started just about a year ago. It's very
Okay.
small right now. It's kind of on its ground level.
Yeah.
And I talk a lot about relationship building and community building. And, I'm hoping this summer to spend a little bit more time digging up some resources and things like that. So it's Turn and Actually Talk based
Okay.
on the instructional practice that, we use in a lot of classrooms. I kind of came from an idea of connection, which
Mhm.
so interwoven to the idea of trauma informed practice, social justice, that interconnectedness that sometimes is missing in order
Yeah.
for, make the changes in the relationships that we need in education. So
Yeah. Amazing. Wonderful. Well, I will go ahead and link your Instagram and your LinkedIn below so folks can connect with you and, learn from you further on your Instagram. If you care about social justice and education, be sure to subscribe to our channel and also join into the Little Justice Leaders community. We have programs for schools, educators, and families. So I'll link those all below so you can find a way to get involved. And we also share tons of free resources as well across social media. So be sure to get plugged into our community. But Katie, thank you so much for being here. This has been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate you.
thank you. This is great.